All right. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and today I'm joined by Drew Hart, who who, who inspired quite a diverse collection of questions from everyone in the God of Justice online class. They were inspired by a rather wide-ranging lecture at looking at the history witness of the Black Church in the American experience. And if you want to go and haven't watched the lecture yourself, you can go to faithandpolitics.net. You'll be able to get that along with a host of others, like the amazing lecture we talked about earlier this week with Malcolm Foley. So yeah, pumped to have you here, Drew. And maybe before we hop into some of the different questions and topics that came up, from the lecture, I'd love for you to give everyone an idea of just how your own faith journey intersected with your intellectual quest, and how that kind of like birthed the vocation you have as a scholar and a Christian.
Yeah. So I'm actually not just a PK. I'm like the child of it. Like, my great grandfather was like a preacher and church planter. My grandfather started about like 10 Black churches on the East Coast, mostly in the Philly area, but as high as one in Boston and one, I think, in Baltimore. So my dad was for most of my upbringing, my pastor, though my grandfather was my first. So I've got this long legacy in the Black church, and yeah, deeply shapes who I am. I often say, you can't understand who I am, my gifts, my questions, how I kind of engage outside of my experience in the Black church, broadly. And then also, and this is kind of stepping outside of maybe some of the scholarship that was presented today, I also have a foot in Anabaptist circles. So some people know me for engaging Mennonites and Church of the Brethren and all these other Anabaptist groups as well. And so really since adulthood, I've kind of had a foot in both of those spaces, both communally, like those are important communities for me, but also then academically as well. So when I'm teaching, I teach this fall, I'm teaching an African-American theology course. In the spring, I'll be teaching African-American theology and Anabaptism, an Anabaptist course as well in the spring. Doing lectures, writing, researching. My latest book, actually, so it's called Making It Plain, Why We Need Anabaptism in the Black Church. So it's bringing all these kind of conversations together. So a lot of the stuff that was talked about today are really significant and personal questions. And I'll say one more thing, especially when it comes to this question of justice in the Black church and Black experience. So we could talk about the Black church broadly, but then I like to focus in and zone in on what I call the prophetic tradition of the Black church, right? This prophetic stream. I didn't grow up in what I would call the prophetic stream. I would call what I grew up in as Black evangelicalism in terms of my early formation. So think like anywhere from Tom Skinner to Tony Evans, right? Like that would have been where a lot of people are coming from. Black consciousness a little bit in Tom Skinner, certainly leaning and having a lot of proximity to whiteness with Tony Evans, but definitely theologically evangelical. When I got exposed to the broader Black church as an adult, really realizing the significance of that tradition in terms how its roots go back to abolitionism under slavery, right? The struggle, the freedom struggle, all throughout the 20th century, climaxing in the civil rights movement. And so having kind of more relationships and growing in those spaces as well has also been really important. Not to say that I have ongoing gifts that I learned from the community that formed me, but also that broadening experience and exposure has deepened my own faith and scholarship and all of that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's really helpful. You mentioned growing up in Philly. So are you a Phillies fan?
Yes, kind of, in the most meaningless way of saying I support everything Philly.
Okay.
And I walk around with like a Phillies cap, a black one, but I'm really supporting Philly more than the Phillies, you
All
know?
right. Well, the Dodgers start game 1 with the Phillies.
Okay.
On Saturday.
I wouldn't even know that.
See, I was up late watching them close out last night. I try to put all of my us versus them energy into things that, only on the rare occasion, usually on the East Coast, erupt in violence.
Yeah, yeah.
And hopefully
Happen with Philly fans, of course.
Oh.
You never know what we're gonna do, and I'm all for it. So hey.
Look, I haven't been there's not video of Dodger fans booing Santa Claus.
That's right. That's right.
And I think the preacher's kid bit is fascinating. So you talked about, and I'm a preacher's kid as well. I was a Baptist preacher's kid in the South, and then through that, there are all these like adjacent parts of your church life, and you can come to discover one that's like connected to where you came from, but all of a sudden you're like, oh, well, this is this is my tribe,
These
right?
are
So
my people.
like you can be Baptist, but then you can be like the Rauschenbusch, Carter, King style Baptist,
Right.
and you're like, oh, now I found my tribe. And I think one of the things that came up in your talk that showed up in a number of questions, and I'll use Marcus' question here, is that prophetic strain, right? And he asked the question this way. He said, you argue that God takes sides with the oppressed. How do you reconcile this with theological traditions that emphasize God's universal love and impartiality?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And one of the things I actually want to think with Kelly Brown Douglas, who actually directly kind of tackles these kinds of questions in her most recent book, Resurrection Hope, right?
Oh, it's a great book.
It's a great book. And so she talks about how sometimes some Christian traditions are framed out of white dominant cultural imaginations. And so they struggle to do the paradoxical thinking and instead think of a binary between. So it's either God takes sides, right? Or God has a universal love for everybody. Which one is it, right? And one of the things that she emphasizes on this particular point is, if the love of God is most expressed through the crucified Christ, right, then it is almost at the same time as is an expression of love for humanity, it is also God taking sides by joining in the very conditions and identifying with the crucified of the world, right? So it's both of those things happening simultaneously. So it's not one or the other. It's actually that God's broad love for humanity is not neutral on oppression and crucifixion and suffering, disproportionate suffering in our world, right? And so I think that's how I reconcile it. Is I think that we can have that kind of, a scholar might say dialectical, right, approach, or that paradoxical way of holding both of those things together, that does not allow God's love, or sometimes it's God's unity, or whatever it is, to erase the particularity and specificity of the commitments of Jesus Christ and the way that he lived his life on this earth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, even thinking to Kelly's book, who, by the way, Kelly's joining us at Theology Beer Camp in 2 weeks. So for all of you coming in person or online, get ready because Resurrection Hope interview was what inspired the members to vote her up to get the invite. So
she's excellent.
Yeah. But one of the bits in that I found really helpful is the way in which the cross contextualizes resurrection. And then so like, where were you standing in that moment? Changes what love looks like, right? You can have universal love, but for the executor and the executed, what love looks like is different. And I found that a helpful way, because so often I think like you even talked about like how it shows up in kind of the more prosperity streams of the church. We only have a theology of glory, or we only have a theology of winning. And then the individual is now burdened with responsibility for any injustice or pain or shame and stuff that we're left to address with.
Yep, absolutely.
Do you what was it like for you in kind of moving kind of towards that prophetic tradition? Like, what was it like to first encounter that invitation of God taking sides, and not just kind of dismiss it on behalf of some universal horizon, but recognize it as the actual contextualization of a divine love that doesn't set justice aside?
Yeah, I mean, there were multiple things that were happening in my life. I mean, in some ways, it felt like it was almost like I've been waiting for this my whole life kind of moment, right? That's how it was for me. So I went off to Messiah as an undergrad, and two things were happening simultaneously for me. one hand, I was realizing that so many of my white evangelical peers were deeply racist in ways that my Black church did not prepare me for, right? I was not ready for the racial prejudice and antagonisms and the ongoing, you could say, trauma of 4 years of being in community with so many of my white evangelical peers. And at the same time, in the classroom, I'm being exposed to a God of justice, right? And I'm being challenged to think critically about the texts and how it works and things like that, and think about the prophets and the life of Jesus, and certainly from a very strongly Anabaptist kind of orientation in that way. Then after I graduate, I felt like I still had more questions. I was not satisfied. Like I had, especially, I really wanted to understand, like, how could so many white Christians be so racist? Like that was like my leaving. That's what I was left with. That was probably the gift probably of all the trauma. If there is a gift out of it, that would be it, is that I had this deep question that was unanswered. And so I started reading all kinds of stuff. I was reading like Michael Eric Dyson, Cornel West, and all stuff. Then I stumbled upon James Cone's God of the Oppressed, right? This is the first Cone book. It was like a year or two after I graduated, reading it on my own. And I'm like, this guy's asking all my questions. And it just made sense. And I don't know if the first read through, because I read it multiple times, the first read through, I just like trying to keep up with all the arguments and stuff, because it both resonated and I felt like he was asking my questions, but also it was of a different frame. It was complete. I was used to like again, Tom Skinner's, right, who are asking important questions, but they're limited by the framework of evangelicalism, could only ask it in so many ways as it rests with Black consciousness and Black oppression and such. And all of a sudden, James Cone seemed free to really ask the deep, profound questions. And so that for me was like a yearning of the heart of like, I've been waiting for someone to scratch this itch, and now we're here. And so, yeah, I'm grateful for that transition that made my move into both Black liberation theology, the Black prophetic tradition, all of that really seamless. And it actually helped me understand some of my lived experiences that I had gone through before, and also wrestle with some of the gaps of my own faith community, right? All the gifts, but also the gaps that existed in the community that raised me.
Yeah. Okay, so in the lecture, you cover quite a bit of history, and one of the distinctions you draw, Jennifer picked up for her question, where she asked, can you elaborate on the distinction between enslaved people adopting versus adapting Christianity? What were the most significant theological differences?
Yeah, I mean, so it's really helpful to differentiate these things and to try to do it with some nuance that, sometimes in I can move in spaces, certainly, especially when I was in Philly. I'd be in north of Philly, and one of my neighbors might say, well, Christianity is the white man's religion, right? Which there's fair enough reason for why it's been labeled that, because it certainly has been weaponized as a white man's religion many times. But as it relates to Black faith, Black people aren't just empty, receptacles of white theology, just adopting everything that they're being taught. And we actually have a pretty profound image of what they believe, because it's been passed on through the spirituals and through abolitionist writings and such like that. So we have a pretty clear understanding of some of the ways that many people are articulating and understanding and expressing their faith. And so they aren't just reproducing the same thing that's being articulated. They really are reinterpreting it for themselves. They really are adapting it for themselves, and they're creating something new. Yes, it's in conversation with white Christianity, but it is a whole new faith expression that's emerging in this moment as well. So some of the examples then, when you look at the beliefs around, and maybe it's helpful to also say, what are they being taught, right? So they're being taught that God ordained their enslavement. They're being taught that there is in fact, especially when you get to the antebellum area, they're actually arguing that there are multiple creations, right? That we all did not come from one humanity, that there are hierarchies of race that are built in, and that they were designed for labor and for enslavement, and that they ought to embrace their suffering as a faithful way of living out the social order that God has ordained. And so they're encountering Bible preaching that is basically justifying a racialized chattel slavery system. And yet when they steal away, when they illegally gather together, taking risks because it was so meaningful for them, in the hush harbors, there they encounter a very different God and a very different Jesus, right? There, all of a sudden, we see that their understanding of God is a God of justice. It is a God that deeply and profoundly identifies with their suffering, a co-sufferer. Jesus himself is a co-sufferer with them, understanding intimately what they're going through, is present with them in the midst of their struggles. He's a friend in hard times, right? And he's a liberator. This is the God who's going to lead them out of their enslavement, out of their oppression, and into freedom. And so God is the one that's going to facilitate their break. If God could do it for the Israelites, why can't he also do it for us, was the logic, right? And so there was this deep belief that this was the very character of God, deep to the core of who God was, is a God of justice and liberation, of freedom, that has joined and intimately cares about the suffering of these enslaved African people. And so I think fundamentally there is a deep contrast between the kind of otherworldly Christianity. I mean, what's being preached is spiritual, right? It's for your saving souls. It's a spiritual reality. It doesn't change your social and political status in this world. And the God that they're experiencing is the exact opposite. It's present. It's in the moment. And God is going to help facilitate their struggle for freedom and their break out of slavery. And it does also have a word for afterward. Like, they did have a hope because they're living through hell, right? They're struggling, hell on earth, literally, in terms of thinking about the torture that they're experiencing every day to keep up with the level of productivity that these white slave owners wanted. And so they are hoping for something else beyond as well. This, which is an indictment on the way that white Christians were living their lives in such ways that people did dream and hope for something else other than their lived experience there. But fundamentally, it wasn't an abandonment of this world. That was an indictment on the structures and systems that were facilitating their suffering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you in your lecture, you gave a nice little shout out to one of my dissertation advisors, Monica Coleman, and she's made a point that really resonates with the next question from Sarah. What Sarah asked, you mentioned that enslaved people had all new questions born from their experience. Can you give specific examples of these questions versus Western theological questions? And it reminds me of Monica saying, like, every time a student, usually a very privileged white student's naive enough to say, well, I'm just not interested in contextual theology. I like real systematic theology. She's like, we just need to change real systematic theology to Anglo theology.
That's right.
And that tradition. And then you start to see that like that theology's come from context is just what happens when a living God encounters a living faith in bodies. But Sarah put it in a similar way. But the connection.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's great, right? Like, everyone is contextual. No one is just, it's not like God is giving us all the questions and the answers. We're making sense within our lived experiences, within the social realities and the challenges that emerge. I think, who was it? Vincent Harding. I think he's the one who said, it's not just that I think he was talking about slave masters and slaves. They didn't just have different answers to questions, but they had different questions altogether, right? That is starting their reflections, and maybe bring James Cone back into the conversation as well. Like, he starts off in God of the Oppressed by naming some of so often white theologians have often thought of themselves as universal people, right? These are the standard questions of Christianity. But in reality, like, when you look at the kind of concerns that Black people had, and then you look at the concerns that they had, I think Cone says it like this: had Luther been, right, an enslaved African, his question would have been about the ubiquitous presence of Jesus at the table. It would have been, is Jesus present with me in the fields and on the auction block, right? And while someone's being whipped, like, your lived experiences are going to shape your questions. And so all the questions that Black people are reflecting on are emerging out of their actual lived experience. They're facing their families being torn apart. They're facing the brutality of white Christians claiming Jesus, but at the same time, right, engaging in some of the worst behavior. So then you can have Frederick Douglass say, there's nothing farther apart than, the Christianity of this land and true Christianity. And he says, I hate the slave holding, woman whipping, cradle robbing Christianity of this land, but I love the peaceable Christ, right? And so all of these reflections are reflection, again, not just on our answers, but the questions that are emerging out of our lived experience. And so it's striking that so few white American Christians, given the literacy and availability to read if they wanted to, so many different sources, the biblical text, all that, thought so little about Black people's lived experience, right? And their responsibility to their Black neighbors. I think that's more, maybe for me, is more striking, is the questions that were not raised in white contexts, given claiming to be followers of Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Yeah. And and on top of that, there's also this sense that but the questions that are raised, that the incarnate one is the executed one, I think make certain questions normative for Christian discourse, right? And I think that's one of the connection points you make between the Mennonite tradition and the larger Anabaptist tradition's commitment to the teachings of Jesus, nonviolent resistance, these kinds of things, and that prophetic stream within the Black church.
Yeah, it's a great intersection where they both reject and kind of abstract universal Christ and want to turn to the specificity of the human Jesus, right? And the specificity of the birth, life, teachings, death, and resurrection, and see that as the starting point for all Christian theology and practice, is wrestling with that. And still, obviously, like, Anabaptists have done that out of their own lived experience, right? And they brought certain questions that related to their experience of their out of European Christendom, and Black folk out of, Black, anti-Black oppression and enslavement and Jim Crow and such. And so they didn't have all the same answers, but they did recognize the significance of undercutting some generic Christ and just Jesus in your heart, or believe, all that kind of stuff. It had to be concrete and had to be lived and had to be practiced. And there's where I think interesting conversation can come through, is anybody that, because they're pressed, their backs are against the wall, right, as Thurman says, leads them to see the reality of the human Jesus, and why we have to take that Jesus seriously to undercut the weaponizing of Christianity so often.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes me think of just how different, even take the different European experiences of Christianity in Protestantism, how different they are if it's a magisterial reformer, where the Reformation's coming through the power of the state, and the Anabaptist movement, where like Felix Mance, this past summer, I got to go to Zurich, and my kids were poorly did not know that walking by a small little plaque to Mance next to a ginormous statue of Zwingli, they were going to get their dad's impromptu historical theology lecture, where you're he got baptized a third time by the Presbyterians, and they killed him. And that's why you should always worry if someone is telling you that biblical Christianity is properly attuned to running the state, because they killed our people. And but that experience, created a context within the early American experience where the abolitionists emerge out of much more frequently out of the Anabaptist or the Quaker tradition, those whose experience, even in white bodies, were executed and repressed by the more magisterial or state-friendly expressions of the faith.
Yeah, absolutely. They definitely immediately, from 1683, as Mennonites are coming, they immediately realize slavery is wrong. And in 1688, Mennonite Quaker hybrid group is writing the very first anti-slavery petition in America, right? And so I think that orientation from the underside and a rejection of Christendom absolutely created a posture for being able to actually engage faithfully in this new context.
Yeah. Yeah.
or more faithfully, because I still have my critiques on too much political quietism at times. But nonetheless, they had an awareness that it was wrong, and they didn't participate mostly in those kind of practices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right before my excursus to Eric, to Mance, we were talking about the historical Jesus, and Eric had a question about this. He said, you emphasize Jesus as an oppressed Jew under Roman occupation. How does a historical reality change our theology?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so just yesterday I was talking with students, and I had them watch the documentary Slavery by Another Name. And Slavery by Another Name, it kind of fills in gaps that I would say most Americans lack, right? Which is the neo-slavery era after formal slavery ends, leading all the way up into like the mid 20th century. So we're talking about like convict leasing systems, peonage, chain gangs. Most people know about sharecropping, and then how lynching interrelated with all those systems. And so what we're talking about is new forms of slavery that arise after slavery is officially over. And they were raising the question of, like, they were shocked and horrified at the Black codes that helped to facilitate that. So there's these laws that are put in place that pretty much target being Black, right? You need permission to change jobs, vagrancy, all kind of stuff that, I mean, folks who are fresh out of slavery, it's so manipulative and so targeted that only it's going to be targeting Black folks and their conditions that they're experiencing right now. And then they could easily be leased for cheap labor, and then they're again coerced and exploited once again. And so we're talking about the ways that they see that going on, and then thinking about Jesus's own lived experience, right? Because some people would say, even today when it comes to immigration, oh, well, they're breaking the law, right? And I always say, well, let's reflect. Is Jesus the starting point for our theology? Because he was giving a state-sanctioned execution under Roman imperial powers, right? So if that is the lens through which we interpret this, then Christians should be the first ones to question the conflation of criminality and sin, as if those things are, one and the same. So his historical reality, the conditions of Jesus's life, actually do pull the curtain back on so many things that are going on in our present day and how we understand them. So we can easily criminalize folks who are caught up in our, industrial prison complex, or we can see also that it disproportionately impacts Black and brown folks, poor people, unhoused people, people experiencing mental health crises, right? Like, those are the most vulnerable of our society, are the most impacted. And turning our eyes, fixing our eyes on Jesus and the conditions and the world that he lived in should also, as we try to follow after him, should then turn our eyes to the folks and the conditions in our own world today as well. And so it should provide an analysis, right? A critical analysis for how to engage and perceive and interpret and respond to the world that we inhabit today.
Yeah. Woody Guthrie had this line when one of his songs about Jesus, where he said, Christians love the law, but the lawman killed Jesus. And just like the historical Jesus and putting him in his own context, the same kind of dynamic happens when we start to read Paul in his historical context. Absolutely. All of a sudden, all this discourse about the law isn't just about religious law. It's that the law is the divinization of the state's power and the preservation of top-down power on behalf of civilization. And that dynamic is like running right through the New Testament. But often it requires, right, that situation in your own context to ask a question that doesn't naturalize and normalize perverse structures of power, but from the perspective of those who are experiencing its injustice.
Yeah, absolutely.
You had a couple aggressive lines that questioners like to follow up on. Kevin asked, you say the greatest threat may be white progressives who leave oppression structures intact. Isn't this overstating it compared to active white supremacists?
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. So I guess one of the things, first we got to define, like, what do we mean by white supremacy, right? So I'm thinking about a society organized by the organizing principle of white supremacy that is that values and creates a hierarchy where white people, white ideas, and white culture are valued more than everyone else, and on an anti-blackness spectrum in which African people, indigenous people often around the world as well, but an anti-black framework that is oppositional to whiteness, that disproportionately impacts black people in terms of valuing their lives. And so it's structured, it's baked in everyday life. We can see it in more subtle ways of the advantaging and disadvantaging in terms of, like, in fact, I'm just coming back from a meeting at my school for my kids in an underfunded school district, right? And so we can see the ways that certain communities are overfunded, other communities are underfunded, right? These are just everyday things that we take for granted and we don't even worry about. So if white supremacy is baked into our society, if anti-blackness is baked into our society and it impacts economic realities, housing, access to health care, right? Our life expectancies, all kinds of stuff, safe neighborhoods, investment in neighborhoods or disinvestment in neighborhoods, right? And a whole history of things that have come in the past that also are shaping our present, redlining, right? All the history. Anyway, so if we're talking about these big systems, the fact of the matter is that these things could not exist and would not persist if so many nice white people, right? So you use a little bit of Kelly Brown Douglas. She has a whole chapter on that. And many others have said, in fact, I've said that in my first book, Trouble I've Seen. But like, these systems could not exist if people who had any kind of commitment to justice all would actually resist it. But the very fact that folks are willing to leave these structures intact, right, to go along with the status quo as it is, suggests to me that anybody that does do that is not really an ally or a brother or sister or sibling in the struggle, right? They're not committed to my liberation, to my community's liberation. They might be friendly, they might be sympathetic, but they're not empathetic, and they're not joining in the struggle in solidarity and in practice. And so, as far as I'm concerned, they are white supremacists, right? It sounds harsh, but again, I'm not saying that they're neo-Nazis or KKK, but I'm saying that their practice of leaving structures, the white supremacist structures, intact is also part of the problem, and it could not function without their ongoing submission to the system as it is. So I think that that would be the issue. And that was the concern when Dr. King wrote his letter from Birmingham jail. That was his primary concern. He got all this pushback from 8 moderate white clergy who were saying, be gradual and everything takes time. And he goes on and says, like, they're the greatest threat. It's not the KKK. It's the folks who claim to be friends, but actually are not going to be committed to your liberation, and then want you to delay it for another generation. Well, at that point, it was 350 years in. Now we're 400 some years in. It's time to struggle and resist and to not submit to the status quo structures that exist today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you think that or what role does kind of American Christianity unique allergy to class analysis keep so much of this intact? And I asked that because I didn't think much about it until I was, teaching at the University of Edinburgh, and there you encounter like Tim Keller or like PCA style reformed theologians that make me uncomfortable for every reason they make process thinkers uncomfortable. Yeah. But they're also like, but I mean, original sin. So we're socialists. Like, it's just obvious that class analysis is essential because we're Christian. It's not, we don't have the opportunity not to do that. But these same theological traditions in America,
in American context, because we're capitalists, and they can't imagine anything outside of capitalism, right? Because it's so baked into Anglo-Protestant identity in the United States, that's what it is to be a true American, and that's what it is to be a true Christian. So capitalism, American identity, and Christian identity are all conflated together as one and the same thing. So it does certainly, in fact, it's heresy to think outside of a capitalist framework. You've at that point, you've left Christianity because you care about the poor. So which I always went like, what do you do with Jesus? I don't know how he fits into this
Yeah, I
framework.
mean, earlier this week, Malcolm said, I mean, come on, Jesus only gave us one either or, and it's mammon. It's just
That's right.
I had a student who was from the Northeast, very conservative, reformed, white theologian. He we were supposed to be working on his research project in a science class, and you could tell, when you're like, oops, I know I'm in professor mode, but they're about to do, I want to talk to my pastor, and you kind of see the emotion coming up, and I was like, is something wrong? And he goes, Trip, C.S. Lewis, Karl Barth, Paul Tillich, Martin Luther King Jr., like, they don't agree on almost anything except capitalism is immoral.
That's
and you could see him, he's like just about to cry, and he's like, what were they thinking? And, but you could just see it coming through, and in it, he's like, I don't think if I hadn't moved here and was just in a different place and voiced what just was normal in my church context, to see people that agree with me about everything theologically, down to the stuff that makes you roll your eyes, Trip, would I have ever thought class consciousness is part of Christ consciousness.
Right.
And I think of that because that's, I think, the experience, that's one of the elements underneath the way kind of like white progressive Christians end up being blindly allegiant to the inertia of so much systemic injustice, is like you haven't experienced a world otherwise to let you know that, what, that might just be the American dream. It may not be the Holy Ghost.
That's absolutely.
And so those kind of experiences are, I think, helpful. And in the American context, one of the things that you raised throughout the lecture is like, this should be one of the gifts that the Black church gives the rest of the American church, is to tell you what the actual experience is for those who aren't in a long line of inheriting stolen land and stolen labor, and then just calling it your retirement plan or your home equity, and going like, well, I mean, I bought the house. I didn't personally,
Yeah, no, I mean, that's, and I do, I mean, and I think I did push buttons probably a little bit, pushing on white progressives and white liberals, but I do want to hit this point again, which connects to this, is like, so as much as I move in white progressive space, like, sometimes I feel like the only thing that makes someone a white progressive is how you handle gender and sexuality. And you could completely ignore, right, class, and all these structures and systems that are literally devastating communities, both domestically and around the world, right? And so we just, slap a sticker on it, right? And then we're all good. And that's fundamentally not going to do the work. That's not going to get us to where we need. And we need to talk about gender and sexuality. So I'm not taking those off the table, but we need a much more holistic, multidimensional, interlocking systems of oppression kind of analysis that does take seriously, like, Jesus is consistent about poverty. And if we're not serious about poverty and the systems that reproduce it, and the exploitation of people and workers' rights and all those kind of things, like, if those things are sidelined and marginalized, I don't know how we can say we're actually truly taking Jesus seriously in our own lives today.
I don't know. Drew, I think it'd be a lot easier if we just had a gender-inclusive bathroom at church rather than address the multi-generational exploitation of wealth through redlining in poor public schools. That sounds a lot more complicated.
It's a lot more complicated, and it might make us realize it's not just those bad conservatives, but we also have work. We also have to confess and lament and repent and make amends for the harm that's been caused intergenerationally, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Rebecca's question, I think, really picks up here. She said, you're more critical of white liberal Christianity than many expect. And this is my nice version. She had a long example of just how uncomfortable she was listening to it. And then she said it was either indigestion or the Holy Ghost. Can you explain why gradualism and sympathy without solidarity are particularly problematic?
Yeah. I mean, so the gradualism, I mean, that's what, so I always think with my dialogue partner. So immediately when I see that word, the first, I think of Niebuhr, and I think of Cohen's critique in The Cross and the Lynching Tree, which he just does a phenomenal job of critiquing the failures of Niebuhr, who is this brilliant theologian, right? With great analysis and one of the most significant theologians and ethicists of the 20th century in the United States. And yet, really was meaningless as it related to Black people suffering, disproportionate suffering going on, right? And the concerns for racial justice. He did have analysis for poverty, right? He even cared and responded to some of the concerns of his Jewish siblings. But when it came to anti-Black oppression and exploitation, there was a gap there. And all of a sudden, the gradualism comes out. And it's just, these are just realistic things that, you just got to kind of work through it. And so I do think that white liberal Christianity fails to often empathize and step into the shoes of their Black siblings, right? To join in fully and to understand from that vantage point and then live in solidarity. Because I think that I'm confident that if it were their loved ones, if it was their children at the underfunded school, if it was their folks who are being policed and stopped and frisked, walking from home to school, right? If you had siblings who, and like I have two of my brothers, people look at me and be like, "Oh, Drew, you got a PhD, right? You got this is the dream." But both of my other brothers have been through the system and neither have a college degree, right? So like, that's the realities, is that I'm the exception, not the rule, right? And so if those relationships were there, or if at least, and I would say, because you don't actually need those relationships, but you do need to be able to see someone and recognize their dignity and their worth and empathize with what they're going on. The great insights of Jesus's story of the Samaritan story is, this is a person who didn't cause the harm. As other people walk by, religious folks walk by, he sees and is stopped because of his compassion for him. That's the first thing. Then he draws near and then he acts, right? And he's fully committed to his restoration and healing, and does everything that he can, including putting him on, caring for him, putting him in, and writing a blank check, basically saying, so like, that's love. That's justice. That's action in its fullness. Justice delayed, though, is always justice denied. And so white progressives and white liberals too often have these moderate, gradual steps because it's not their own suffering. So it's easy to tell someone that you don't love, oh, it's unfair, but this is just going to be the way it is. But if it was your own family, you'd be fighting like hell to try to change the conditions that you're suffering under immediately. And it would be unrelenting, and you'd be fully committed to it because it's impacting people that you love, not just yourself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So, you also talk a bit about the diversity within the Black church in the lecture and that kind of thing. And there are a number of questions that came there. So Brandon asked, you mentioned the various streams in contemporary Black theology, including prosperity gospel. How do you evaluate theological diversity within Black churches?
Critically. So my new book, I mean, people are going to be shocked, as in fact, I think already people are a little surprised. I love, there was a review from Tobin Miller Scherer who calls my book a love letter. And the reason why is because you might expect with the title, why we need, Anabaptist Black church, and I'm just gonna be patting everybody on the back in terms of those two communities and just maybe critiquing everyone else. I do critique white mainstream American Christianity, but I also critique both of those traditions as well. And so the Black church, I am concerned about the prosperity gospel, and I think it's a huge departure from the way of Jesus Christ. I am critical of the ways that even outside of that, there's this slow assimilation and adoption from many worship leaders in terms of slowly bringing in CCM music. I think this is death dealing, I think, for the church, as I see this trend growing and growing, where they're kind of being fed by white evangelical mainstream mega church systems and stuff, and the the trends of that are popular at the moment. So I'm very critical of all communities, and in a healthy way, not a critical as in negative, but critical as in that we need to just sort through what we need to hold on to and what we need to discard, where we are, what are the challenges that we're facing. For my own church, I mean, I'm deeply critical of the paternalism that I grew up in under, and I've been blatant. That's not a hidden secret. Like, I've spoken to the pastors there, including my own dad, right? The whole pastoral team there, about what I see as the patriarchy baked into the system there. So I think that we've got to be able to have open, honest conversations in love. And I do that with the Black church as a whole. And that's part of the reason why I point to, and again, no one's perfect, but I do point to the Black prophetic tradition, which I think embodies the best of the Black church. And I invite others to really take that seriously, to engage in conversation with Black womanist theology for critical reflection. Many Black churches are, even good ones that are doing great work, are disconnected and are not having conversations, or not even aware of sometimes these great theologians that are doing all this work. And so, yeah, I'm critical in the best way, because I love the Black church and I want it to be and embody the best. And I remember the significance, the important role that it has played, through slavery, Jim Crow, up to we wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the Black church. And so I'm grateful for it, but also know that we have new challenges and new questions that we've got to confront in our own generation that have to be taken seriously.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, David asked a question here that gets at that connection between Anabaptism and the Black church. He said, you mentioned Nat Turner's apocalyptic slave revolt. How does Black theology navigate the tension between prophetic violence and Christian nonviolence?
Yeah. That's great. I probably will surprise everyone a little bit with my answer to this, because I tend to be, I call myself a peacemaker, but I don't usually call myself a pacifist. And so I critique everybody, and I'm dissatisfied with all the frameworks that we have, pretty much. But I will say this: I do believe, first and foremost, Jesus has in central to who Jesus is an ethic of peace and peacemaking. And I think that we can try to ignore that all that we want, but it is so central to who Jesus is and his teachings. It's so fundamental in the Sermon on the Mount, in the way that he lives his life, his commitment to loving enemies, literally being crucified rather than crucifying his enemies, right? Killing his enemies. And so I think it's modeled throughout his life. He laments as he's approaching Jerusalem in Luke 19, I believe it is. If only they had known the things that make for peace. This is a foretelling and a prediction in the Synoptic Gospels of the Jewish Roman wars that are coming 66 to 70 AD. So there's these deep concerns. We could go on and on about how that shows up in the life of Jesus. And so I am a committed peacemaker and participating in the peacemaking of God in the world. However, I don't make rules. I don't think that that some kind of elaborate ethical system that decides before I'm in a moment what to do is satisfactory for navigating the complexities of really deep, profoundly, think about the systems of violence and the cycles of violence, the spirals of violence, all of that, right? That impact, we're all complicit in violence all the time already. I pay taxes, I'm participating in violence, right? The times that I don't speak up and challenge and resist oppressive systems, I'm complicit in violence. Oh, it's embedded, and we're a part of this huge web of violence and oppression already. So none of us are truly non-violent in and of itself as a posture. It's just not even possible. And certainly if you're in the US, we're all deeply, deeply, deeply complicit in all forms of violence. That said, we ought to be seeking shalom where we are, everywhere we are, participating in peacemaking as creatively and as much as possible. And so I believe that we ought to always be looking to participate, asking God for the Spirit to give us inspiration for how we can seek peace where we are in concrete ways all the time. And there are times, I often say, like I've used the Nat Turner example, and say, honestly, if I'm in Nat Turner's place, I have no peacemaking initiative suggestions for Nat Turner. I got none, absolutely none, right? Like if I'm in his situation, I'm not like, oh, I think this could have worked out and led to more shalom instead of that. Like, no, this is, 1831, right? 1831. And the generations and generations of people have been born under slavery. Slavery is actually getting worse in the antebellum era during that time. It's more brutal, more violent, because the production of cotton is making a lot of people wealthy. So every year from 1800 to 1860s, there's an increase in productivity that's expected of every single individual person. They just keep leveling up and putting the pressure, and they're torturing to get that level of productivity. This is an extremely violent situation. His loved ones are being tortured, or being raped, or being humiliated, and there seems to be no end. And he believes he's seen a sign, right? Now, did he see a sign? That's between him and God. I don't know what his spiritual experience was, but I tell you this, I do believe that God was against the system that he was experiencing. And I can't fathom anything non-violent that was going to disrupt that such in-baked system of violence and oppression in that moment, right? Not from his spot. Maybe there might have been things I think that Northerners could have been doing to shift the situation, but from his condition and his place, I got no suggestions for him, right? Now, that said, if I'm in that place, maybe I think I would say pray to God that God gives us creativity to see that peacemaking pathway forward, that if there's something available that can create more shalom, more healing, more liberation, right, then we take it. But I can't see it from his vantage point. And so that maybe that's the messiness of my answer is I don't like the clean cut Christian pacifist answers sometimes. Even though I'm not an advocate for violence, I'm not an advocate for just war theory, though I think maybe just war theory, if it was actually practiced, maybe I'd be closer to it, because at least they were the last resort thing, and all these criteria have never actually been implemented. So maybe there'd be some proximity there. So yes, theologically, I'm closer to the Christian nonviolence position, but in practice, I think I just see it a lot more messier on the ground and lived experience. And I don't think rules will get us to where we need to go in terms of actually following Jesus through the violence and oppression that we see today.
You know what's interesting to me in being asked, not the question that way, but where people go, oh, well, are you going to bend on your principle of nonviolence in this situation? That kind of accommodation in the front of like horrible evil gets looked at you and like, oh, I guess you're not really pure or faithful. But like the accommodation Niebuhr makes is called pragmatic. Right. So if you're accommodating towards the domination system's inertia of perverse power, that's being pragmatic and reasonable, and it's working through the system. But if you're just like, look, I would love a creative, nonviolent way here, but if like I'm not in charge of all the people that are being horrible, like what do you want me to do? Just take it? And so like it's even the way that conversation in question shows up. It tends to come with something that if you are impure to what your deepest commitments are, then I can dismiss you. But if I'm impure, I'm being pragmatic, so you're welcome. And it irritates me.
Yeah, no, that's good.
So this is something I've been trying to think about. Is when you think of that 19th century period, right? You get the cotton gin, you get all the connections that are coming out of it, this growing intensity of violence and suffering and slaveholding context, and the economic incentives make it like you see less in just the preaching within white churches raising the question of abolition or even the treatment of slaves. It diminishes in that time period. You tell that story, and then I wonder, when you think of take artificial intelligence and the breakthroughs that are going there, and now we're more efficient, and we're able to do X, Y, and Z. But underneath that is a whole host of violence. It's just been exported outside of our nation, so we don't see it in the same way. When you think of the mining
Right. The
of minerals
ecological
to the number of
implications are
people who
enormous.
sit and train it, looking
Yeah.
at horrible things, the use of energy and water, like the
Yeah.
consequences of that system, impact on image bearers is huge. It's just
Yeah.
we never see it.
Yeah.
and 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 so like sometimes I sit there and go, we really need to wrestle with this, what this looked like in the past in our own history, because there is a list, a line of people on crosses for our blind commitment to efficiency gains
Yeah.
and wealth creation in the present. It's just
Yeah.
neoliberal capitalism exported the slavery and torture of neighbors, human and non, elsewhere.
Yeah.
So, and I wonder if you see some analogies there, and what's to gain by, like, not just whitewashing the past literally, but learning from the way power distorts the gospel and creates kind of ethical blinders for us.
Yeah, and I think that's really a great way of framing it. And I've often said, like, our nation had to undergo things in a different way than like some of the other great enslaving Western nations, right? Because they had exported it, right? So it wasn't as proximate, right? So when you think about, well, Portugal and Spain got into it, UK, you mean England, I mean, they were enormous, right? In terms of
They
colonization and
outlawed it,
slavery.
but they didn't end the
They
investments.
didn't, right, right. I mean, they, in some ways, they taught America how to do it right, right, and do it well. I mean, they were the teachers. America was the student in that relationship. But what sparked the Civil War in many ways, in terms of internally, and in some ways we've never gotten over the Civil War, is precisely how intimate it was inside within the nation. And so people are actually encountering Black people, right? And so you got to look people in the eye. And some people created such horrific justifications that allowed them to still sleep at night by lying to themselves about who's human, who is not. But some people couldn't, right? And I do think that we've got to keep in our frame of reference those who most disproportionately suffer and are targeted and impacted by these technologies of efficiency and productivity and innovation and all of that. And I think that the danger is that now we are looking a little more like some of these other nations that do it, and we don't, I mean, some of the impacts we do see internally, but so much of it we don't see, and it's pushed out and extended onto other people groups other than our own nation. And I think that without that awareness and that empathy, and then that moving into solidarity and action, we're just as complicit as those other patterns. We should be learning from them, but we're still making the same mistakes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. So there were a number of questions about James Cone. So I think I'll just read two of them, and then you can say whatever you want, because we got so many questions, and I just distracted us by Tripp's own interests. But anyway, here's Christina asked, how do you reconcile those that say Cone's theology is too confrontational and divisive for building racial reconciliation? And Lakeisha asked, Cone argues that any theology in different deliberation is not Christian theology. Is this claim too absolute or exclusionary?
Yeah. I must want to say for the first question, yes, that it doesn't work for racial reconciliation. I guess we got to define what do we mean by racial reconciliation first, right? But yes, I mean, that's some of what I love about Cone. So I was at, let me tell you a little story. So when I read Cone for the first time, so I had graduated college and I was hired at this church in the city that was committed to being urban and racial reconciliation and all that kind of stuff, multi-ethnic, all that stuff in the city, probably on the better side of that tradition than some of the horror stories I've heard, right? But yet, nonetheless, my experience was that there was so much conversations around racial reconciliation as this like interpersonal thing, and very rarely did we actually take seriously the system structures of white supremacy and anti-blackness and xenophobia and stuff that are death dealing even within our own city and our own community, right? We weren't paying attention to the systems and the policies and practices that were crushing our neighbors. It was more about how do we, for this hour and a half, love each other better and name some of the biases that we had, but not necessarily break through to living differently throughout the rest of the week and trying to change the city and how it organizes and engineers, the advantaging and disadvantaging of people's lives. And so racial reconciliation, as many have named, I mean, that's what caused me to want to write my very first book, Trouble I've Seen, was like, that's not, if we're not talking about the power and the hierarchies and the systems and the structures, then we're not doing the work, right? And I think that Cone, one of his concerns was that people want to put reconciliation before liberation. And his was like, no, liberation must precede reconciliation, right? If it's genuine reconciliation, if we're actually reconciled, then how can we be reconciled on unequal terms, right? The one picture I often show students, there's an image of enslaved woman with a white family. She's holding a white baby. This is during the antebellum era. She's enslaved, but she's part of the family picture, right? So I say, is this reconciliation? No, of course not, right? But there's proximity, there's intimacy, there's relationship. So why is it not reconciliation? Because she's still enslaved, right? The hierarchies are still embedded in the relationship itself. So unless there's so liberation is fundamental to reconciliation. And that's one of James Cone's significant arguments. On the other point, right? Yes, like, is it absolute or exclusion? I guess the question is, what is Christianity fundamentally? That's really what we have to kind of wrestle with, right? Is liberation and justice central, a definitive characteristic that the moment it is gone, it is no longer the faith of Jesus Christ and what he invites us into, right? I would say yes, that is so central, so definitive to the faith of Jesus Christ, how he lives his life and what he teaches, what he means by this apocalyptic insurrection of the kingdom of God into the world, right? As a disruption to the Roman Empire. All of that is a decisive response to, like, that is definitive of and characteristic of the faith that Jesus Christ invites us into and to follow after and to participate and embody in our own lives. I understand that people read it other ways, that some people can slice out a more spiritual gospel that is primarily about souls first, and the other stuff is like additions to that. That was what I was raised in. I was raised in a Black evangelical space where they didn't erase justice and liberation from the conversation, but it was an add-on. That's not the gospel itself. I disagree with that. I think that's when throughout the whole scriptures, when they're talking about salvation, they're talking about liberation. I don't think they actually mean the same thing. Salvation, liberation, redemption, all these words, and they're holistic words, and they're all encompassing words, including the socio-political realities that we live in, and that people need liberation from those things. And so I agree with Cone. I think he's right that, and I think he's divisive in the right way, because we have so many centuries of Christianity creating a kind of Christianity that was compatible with slavery, that was compatible with German Christian nationalism, that was compatible with the apartheid, right? It was compatible with conquests and the displacement of indigenous people, right? The moment that we give up the holistic nature of the gospel, including its liberationist, the centrality of the liberation of people from oppression as a part of the definition of the gospel, is creating space for those kind of Christianities to exist without challenge. And so I think that we need to push back against any kind of gospel that's only partially good news and is not fully good news for people's lived experience.
Yeah. I do think when Cone makes a point, Jesus' execution wasn't an accident to fulfill a biblical prophecy so the individual can go to heaven.
Right.
They didn't misunderstand what he was saying. It was a genuine response to the invitation to the kingdom of God.
That's right.
And all right. So we'll do two more, because we haven't touched on these yet, but and this is connected to some more of your own work. Rachel asks, what does a reparations God mean theologically, and how does this differ from general concepts of divine justice?
Yeah, I mean, a reparations God is to recognize that God is about the healing and repair of all things of humanity, and also the way that we organize our lives, and in response to the deep wounds and harms that people have experienced, right? Who is it? Irenaeus, right? I mean, if you understand Irenaeus, is the early Christian theologian, like he understood Jesus's work in terms of, you know, uh, some big words for folks. I don't know what language people are used to, but like, recapitulation, all these terms. But like, he understood like the life of Jesus as healing, literally, right? As a healing of humanity. And so what Jesus experienced and underwent and navigated, he actually healed humanity in that process. And as we are united in Christ and participate and join in that, we also experience healing. That's the new humanity that can be birthed out of it, right? So even in that fundamental understanding of how Jesus saves for Irenaeus is healing. This is so early Christianity. There are many Christians who have kind of, in various ways, a reparative understanding and a healing understanding of the work of God. So we think about God at work, whether it be the Israelites as they escape uh, Egypt, right? And they're told to take some plunder with them, right? So they don't go empty handed after all the centuries of harm that they experience, right? We think about the healing that Jesus invites people to. I just talked recently, just a second ago, about the Samaritan story. That is a healing story, right? It's a response out of love for one's neighbor. Even though he didn't do the harm, he still actually cared. He loved this person enough that he responded to their suffering, uh, took care of them, put them in the inn, and covered all the costs. It wasn't just a debt calculation either. It was above and beyond that, until he was fully healed and restored. And I think that here in the U.S., we sometimes are allergic to the word reparations, not all the time. Actually, in many cases, the U.S. has been very supportive of reparations, right? When it came to the Holocaust and Jews, actually, we lift that up as a great example. Internally, we actually have paid reparations, not sufficiently to indigenous tribes, but there have been some reparations paid to some indigenous tribes, to those who experienced Japanese internment camps. There's been reparations to them. We could go on. There's multiple examples. In fact, some Confederate soldiers, not Confederate, some slave masters who didn't join the Confederacy, especially in D.C., were actually paid reparations, not the enslaved people, but the slave masters who were paid reparations in that moment as well. So America has not been anti-reparations, but usually they've been anti-reparations for Black people. Immediately after slavery, that's when there's this allergy to reparations. Immediately, and Black people just need to pick themselves up from their own bootstraps almost immediately after slavery happened, which sounds silly now. And since then, there's been a desire for healing and restoration and repair, and also explicitly connected to the economic harm that's been caused, the exploitation that wasn't just the 2.5 centuries of slavery, but ongoing through Jim Crow, right? Through all the neo-slavery convict leasing system, chain gangs, all of that, the intentional leaving out of the GI Bill and the Homestead Acts and all these different things, the white progressive laws that helped create the white middle class that Black people were excluded from, all the way up to the present. I mean, I think a scholar actually noted that just the harm from mass incarceration alone, it's like, I think it was like trillions of dollars of economic harm to the Black community, right? So Malcolm X has a great saying. He says, if you stab me in the back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, that's not progress, right? You got to pull it all the way out and then start healing. That's the progress, is when we actually stop the harm altogether and start healing. We've morphed the harm, and it might be overall in collectiveness not as drastic as the worst of the antebellum era of slavery, but it has not stopped. It's just compiling harm upon harm. So what does it mean to bring reparations and healing? And what does God have to say about participating the restoration, healing, and repair of all that's gone on? And not just for Black folk, I would say for white folk, right? That white people need the trauma and guilt. I think they know they are beneficiaries, many do, of so much harm. And so there's needs to be healing of the moral injury, the intergenerational moral injury of being complicit and participating in a community that has either directly perpetuated that harm or has benefited from it. We all need healing from this trauma that our nation has undergone. And I believe that God is facilitating and leading us, and we need to just participate in the healing of God in this world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that allergy to the even discussing reparations among white citizens, this is something, Cornel West has pointed out, is you then end up with the poor and impoverished white people defending the unethical inheritance for the 1%.
Yep.
And as opposed to going, what happened in 2008? Yep. Or what happened in the post-war consensus? Or looking at all the ways that the many are being exploited. It turns the class analysis. It ends up legitimating a reason we don't ever mess with class analysis. Than looking at how the system we're protecting is exploitative to so many people.
And white identity helps fracture that right. And so the moment you start to, Black people's experience, we're not going to deal with, what about us? And so there's this division and divide and conquer that takes place that I think is really significant. So we can't fix the structures as a whole, nonetheless address the specific harms that have happened historically.
Mm-hmm. All right. Last question we'll do is from Mark, who said, at the end of your lecture, you ask whether our theology will stand with or betray God's justice. What does betrayal look like in everyday church life, not just in dramatic moments? Yeah. And in the larger email, he talked about his congregation being one that, easily puts up a rainbow flag and then performs sermons of solidarity and will show up at big events or at rallies or this kind of thing. But what does it look like to take seriously that distinction you're drawing, to think about kind of the everyday church life?
Yeah. I think the betrayal looks in everyday life is when we see the prayers and the sentiments, maybe we could say the sympathy, right, towards these issues, but it's not full solidarity as a way of life. So betrayal looks like communities that say, oh yeah, racism is bad, but we can't talk about reparations, or we can't go that far. We're not willing to get invested in this community organizing work, right? We've got other things to do. And so every time there's an opportunity for the concrete struggle for racial justice, there's always an excuse why that can't actually really be practiced by that community. It's a low priority. And so Black people's lived experiences are deprioritized in that moment. And so I think that for me, it ought to look like, it doesn't make sense to me that communities are not committed to something like community organizing is like, it seems like the most basic, obvious thing. Connecting, coming alongside your neighbors at the points upon which people are feeling most pressed, not just what's being talked about in the media, but like the specifics of your own particular neighborhood and what people are expressing themselves, coming together, sharing in power, right? Not top-down coercive power, but shared decentralized power of the people to address the issues that are affecting us. Like those are the kind of, show up, participate, be all in. Cohen talks about becoming Black, join, fully join in, empathize, link arms, allow, we talk about sharing in sufferings, sharing in joy, be fully all in, so that the sufferings of our community, or the sufferings, what impacts us impacts you, and vice versa, right? Ubuntu, like, we're in this together, and what we experience, it's inseparably connected. We cannot pretend like what happens in one community is not directly related to what's happening in another community. And so I think that, for me, betrayal is allowing oneself to somehow remain in a comfortable white dominant cultural normative experience, and just expressing or signifying concern, versus actually, you know, I'll say, I want to say, like John Brown, again, I'm a peacemaker, so I know it's a crazy example, but John Brown, like, he loved Black people, and he put himself all the way in, right? And it doesn't have to look like violence, but I think being all in, I think, is really important. And I think that if we're going to participate in the racial and economic justice of God, if we're going to fight for the dignity of all people, for all workers, for people who don't have health care, for people who don't have status, immigration status in this country, like, you got to be all in. There's no halfway to do it, and it can't just be empty signifiers. Those things are cheap, and it might excite people just for a little bit, because, like, oh, these people actually care about these things. But then after a while, there'll be deep dissatisfaction and a sense of betrayal, because they'll know when we are really, truly brothers, sisters, siblings in this together, or if this is just some kind of performative, habits that we're kind of moving through.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, this has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate you joining. And for those that want to make sure they get to experience full lecture, you could go to faithandpolitics.net. Now, Drew, where do you want to send people if they're wanting to connect with your work, find links to your books, and you are ubiquitous in all sorts of places on the internet. So is there a nexus to head to?
Kind of. I mean, I do have a website. It's kind of outdated, but I guess it has many of my books there. You can contact me through there. Drew, G-I, Hart, H-A-R-T, .com. So that's my website. But then you can also find all my books are available anywhere books are sold. You can order them anywhere. So Making It Plain, Who Will Be a Witness, Trouble I've Seen. I also have a more academic one, Reparations and the Theological Disciplines. And so you can find my books anywhere, and you can find me online at Drew Hart, DRUHART, for pretty much all my socials. You can find me that way.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, this has been a blast. Thank you. Thank you for everyone that took the time to send in questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but there are a bunch of really good ones. Yeah, so really good. I think